Today, I'm going to talk about Weston Price. So, a lot of people have asked me, what role does diet play? They raised the findings of Weston Price, who was a nutritionist, scientist in the early 1900s. I'm familiar with him because I read his book in around 2016 or so, and I was really into it. My kid was about 2 years old, and we started feeding my kid raw milk and try to get him a lot of the organic diet stuff like we were trying to apply to ourselves and our child. And I don't really follow any of that anymore. And I'll explain why. It's not that I'm saying he's wrong. It's that I'm saying that I think there's a faster way. But let's take a step back. Who's Weston Price? Well, he was a dentist and a researcher from the early 1900s, and he traveled all around the world and visited native people, right? So I think he went to Alaska, he went to the Pacific Islands, he went to the Amazon, and he'd see these people in their native environment eating their native diet, right? Which was still possible in the early 1900s. Now, probably a lot of these natives are anyway eating Western foods. And he noticed an interesting thing. He noticed that they had beautiful teeth, beautiful skulls, great bodies. But if some of the same people had moved and lived at least a generation in kind of a westernized town, then despite the fact that they had the same genetics, they ended up looking much worse, and their teeth were often, they had malocclusions. They weren't as kind of symmetric and healthy, and they were much more susceptible to disease. And at the time, like, he was looking at tuberculosis and things like that. So they would also have a much higher incidence rate of these diseases. And he took a very scientific approach. He documented all these photos and the people he saw, compared kind of people of the same genetics growing up in these two different environments and showing how there was a big difference. So he concluded that if the natives were eating their native diet instead of westernized food, they would be much healthier. And that sugars and these Western kind of flours were bad for human development because they increased like the chance for malocclusion and cavities and things like this. Is this the reason why we have this biomechanical collapse that I talk about, right? Like, where are the similarities? And I think there are a lot. So we're both basically saying, both me and Weston Price, that the misdevelopment of the dental arches and the teeth result in kind of the entire skeleton and skull being negatively impacted and your immune system being much weaker, right? So these are two things, like, he was essentially saying the same thing I am 100 years before me. And he deserves a ton of credit for that because, he took a very scientific approach and in a very logical way showed that this, in fact, was the case. Now, do I think that diet is the main and only reason? No. I think that there's other factors at play as to why this first occurs in humans. So, it could be like the quality of the air, could be like whether the mother her body is compensated. So this is where I'd point out, I visited a couple times this well-known osteopath who was also a dentist named Jim Jackman, and he worked on newborns for many decades. And what he said always stuck with me was that mothers, like kids, so he dealt with newborns, he'd feel the kid's skull and his body, and he'd be able to tell the compensations of the mother by feeling the kid's skull. Also, he said he would be able to pretty accurately predict what kind of malocclusion the kid would have later in life based on feeling kind of and looking at the newborn skull. So this told me that a child can essentially inherit the compensations of the mother without it being genetic, because it's essentially like what compensations the mother has, which is not necessarily genetic because the mother, might have been in good shape earlier in life, but by the time she had the child, she was twisted and whatnot. So I think that there's other factors at play. Why this happens in the first place is what I consider still a bit of a black box to me. Like, I think I know the factors that are involved. I don't know which ones are worse. And I honestly don't put much effort into knowing, because my view is that however the problem started, could have been diet, could have been the mother, could have been like very dirty air and the child was mouth breathing from a very early age and that missed development. But I view it as this, whatever the reason is, you can just fix it with these biomechanics. So, as soon as the child has like some baby teeth in, you put composite, keep it flat, on the back to lower molars and whatever problems the kid has. My view is that they'll resolve over time and the kid will end up being a beautiful child. And I think that would happen even if the kid was eating a Western diet and even if the child, came from a compensated mother. It doesn't matter. Like, you can fix all this after using these simple biomechanics. Therefore, my view on Weston Price is that yes, he came up with some very interesting findings relating, this biomechanical collapse to diet. But if you can fix the issues after using these simple biomechanics, and if the biomechanics work regardless of what you eat, then in my view, diet really doesn't play an important role because you're just going to optimize by doing these biomechanics and then eat whatever you want, which is exactly what I'm doing. Like, I'm eating whatever I want for the last few years and only getting better and better. I eat a lot of processed food. I don't even really pay attention to eating healthy because I know, like, I've done experiments on myself and I just found like it doesn't really matter. My immune system, my energy, my, everything is just improving regardless at more or less the same pace. I think in time, like, people are just going to pay less and less. Once they understand that you can just use these simple biomechanics and be very healthy and that health, diet plays a very secondary role, I think it's just going to kind of lose a lot of its importance to people because, for the same reasons that I viewed, like, I don't know how to fix a car. I don't know how a car works, but I do drive a car and I know that, if it ever breaks, I take it to a mechanic, right? For me, like, diet is a very similar thing. It's like, if I'm healthy and I just need to use these biomechanics, like, I don't really need to know, like, how exactly diet plays a role because I can just cheat and use the biomechanics instead. And so because of that reason, think that the findings of Weston Price, while interesting, are going to lose more and more relevance as time goes on.